A single gunshot shattered the evening silence, making Father Elijah's hands tremble as he gripped his worn Bible. The sound wasn't meant to harm, just another outlaw's way of announcing their arrival in Dustwood. But to Elijah, each shot was a haunting echo of a past he'd tried desperately to bury. The small frontier town of Dustwood stood isolated against the harsh desert landscape, its wooden buildings weathered by sun and wind, its people hardened by the daily struggle to survive. At its heart stood a modest church where Father Elijah had served faithfully for the past 5 years, his gentle demeanor and soft-spoken wisdom earning him the town's respect and trust. But respect wasn't enough to stop Black Jack and his gang from riding into town that fateful morning, their horses' hooves kicking up dust as they circled the town square. Black Jack, a towering figure in a black duster, his face scarred and weather-beaten, pulled his horse to a stop in front of the church steps where Elijah stood. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Black Jack's voice carried across the square, drawing nervous townsfolk to their windows. "A man of God in this God-forsaken place?" His gang snickered, spreading out around him like wolves circling prey. Elijah's response was quiet but clear, his words carrying an authority that made even Black Jack pause. "This town is under the Lord's protection. I suggest you move on." Black Jack's laugh was harsh, echoing off the church walls. "Protection? All I see is a weak man hiding behind a collar." He spat on the ground, his eyes cold. "Listen here, preacher. This town now pays tribute to me. Consider it divine taxation." Elijah stepped forward, his Bible held close to his chest. "Turn from your evil ways," he warned, "for the Lord has set his hand against you." Something flickered in Elijah's eyes as he spoke, something that didn't belong to a simple priest. It was gone in an instant, but Black Jack caught it, and for a moment, his confident smirk wavered. "We'll be back, preacher," Black Jack growled, wheeling his horse around. "And next time, your prayers won't be enough to save these people." As the gang rode out, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces etched with fear. They gathered around Elijah, seeking comfort in his presence. But none noticed how his hands still trembled, not from fear of the outlaws, but from the weight of a secret that threatened to shatter his peaceful existence. Before we continue this gripping tale of faith, redemption, and justice, tell me, what would you do if your town faced such an overwhelming threat? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to hear what happens next in this extraordinary story of a priest with a mysterious past. As dusk settled over Dustwood, Father Elijah sat alone in the dimly lit church, his weathered hands resting on a locked wooden chest hidden beneath the altar. The golden cross around his neck seemed to weigh heavier than usual, much like the burden he carried in his heart. Through the stained glass windows, the setting sun cast long shadows across the empty pews, reminding him of another life, another time. His fingers traced the intricate carvings on the chest's lid, and unbidden memories flooded his mind. Flashes of a younger man with steely eyes and lightning-fast hands, a man known throughout the territory as the Saint. "I left that life behind," he whispered to the empty church. But the trembling in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Outside, the town buzzed with whispered conversations and speculation. At the saloon, old-timers gathered around worn tables, their voices low but urgent. "Did you see how he stood up to Black Jack?" one weathered rancher muttered. "No ordinary priest has that kind of steel in his spine." Another man leaned forward, his gray beard catching the lamplight. "I heard tales of a gunslinger they called the Saint, fastest draw in 3 territories. They say he could shoot a man's gun right out of his hand without drawing blood. Then one day, he just disappeared." "The Saint?" a younger man scoffed. "That's just a legend. Besides, what would a legendary gunslinger be doing playing a priest in a dust bowl like this?" As the sun disappeared completely behind the mountains, Elijah made his way through the darkening streets to a small house on the edge of town. Light spilled from its windows, warm and inviting, and inside, waited the one person who knew his true identity. Abigail Mitchell, the town school teacher, opened the door before he could knock. Her face, lined with wisdom gained through years of frontier life, showed immediate concern. "I saw them ride in," she said, ushering him inside. "It's happening again, isn't it?" Elijah sank into a chair by her fireplace, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his choices. "I can't be that man again, Abigail. I made a vow." "And what about your vow to protect the innocent?" she challenged, her voice gentle but firm. "I was there when you hung up your guns, Elijah. I understood your need for redemption. But sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways." "The things I did," he started, his voice catching. "The things you did saved lives," Abigail interrupted. "The saint wasn't just a killer. He was a protector. People told stories about how he never took a life unless absolutely necessary, how he fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves." Elijah stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "That life nearly destroyed my soul, Abigail. The violence, the killing. I found peace in the church." "And now the church needs the saint," she replied softly. "These people trust you as their priest. They'll need you even more when Black Jack returns." As if to emphasize her words, a distant gunshot echoed through the night, making them both tense. Elijah moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the darkness. For just a moment, Abigail saw not the gentle priest, but the shadow of the man he used to be, straight-backed, alert, dangerous. "I pray it doesn't come to that," he said finally. But they both knew prayers alone might not be enough to save Dustwood. 2 days passed like a held breath, the town suspended in anxious anticipation. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the thundering of hooves announced Black Jack's return. This time, he hadn't come alone. At least 20 riders accompanied him, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that painted the dawn sky brown. Father Elijah stood at the church steps, watching as the outlaws spread through the town like a poison. Black Jack had traded his black duster for a vest adorned with silver buttons that gleamed menacingly in the early light. His gang moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves at strategic points throughout the square. "Quite a welcoming committee," Black Jack called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Your whole flock's come out to greet us, preacher." Indeed, the townsfolk had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They clustered together, seeking safety in numbers, their faces masks of barely contained fear. Elijah remained motionless as Black Jack dismounted, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step toward the church. "The Lord teaches us to welcome all travelers," Elijah responded evenly, "even those who walk in darkness." This drew cruel laughter from the gang. "Listen to him, boys," Black Jack sneered. "Still hiding behind scripture. Tell me, preacher, did your God help the last 3 towns we visited? Did he stop us from taking what we wanted?" One of Black Jack's men, a wiry figure with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, approached old Mr. Peterson's general store. With deliberate malice, he began pulling items from the shelves, tossing them into the dirt. "Nice stock you got here, old man. It would be a shame if something happened to it." "Stop this," Elijah commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made several outlaws pause. "These people have done nothing to deserve your cruelty." Black Jack's face darkened. "Deserve?" he spat. "This ain't about deserving. It's about power. It's about who has it and who doesn't." He turned to address the gathered townspeople. "Here's how this works. You pay us protection money in gold and supplies, and maybe we won't burn this pathetic excuse for a town to the ground." The snake-tattooed man grabbed Mr. Peterson by the collar, shoving him roughly against the store's wall. "Consider this a small demonstration," Black Jack continued, as his man landed a solid punch to the old shopkeeper's stomach. Elijah took a step forward, but 2 outlaws quickly moved to block his path, their hands resting on their holstered guns. The priest's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, something dangerous flickered in their depths, a glimpse of steel beneath the cloth. "Next time won't be just words, preacher," Blackjack warned, mounting his horse. "You've got 3 days to gather what we want. Gold, food, ammunition, whatever you can spare, and a little extra for making us ride out here twice." He wheeled his horse around, addressing the crowd one final time. "Your man of God here can't protect you. The sooner you realize that, the better off you'll be." As the gang rode out, leaving Mr. Peterson groaning in the dust, the townsfolk rushed to help him. But their eyes kept returning to Father Elijah, some with desperation, others with growing doubt. In the distance, Blackjack's laughter echoed off the canyon walls, a promise of worse things to come. The church had never felt so crowded or so tense. As the setting sun painted the stained glass windows in deep crimson and purples, the townsfolk of Dustwood packed the pews, their voices rising in a chorus of fear and anger. Mr. Peterson sat in the front row, his face bruised, but his eyes burning with indignation. "And we can't just sit here and wait for them to destroy everything we've built." Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, stood up, her voice trembling. "Father Elijah, you have to do something, anything." Elijah stood at the pulpit, his collar feeling tighter than usual. The faces before him were ones he'd known for 5 years, people he'd baptized, counseled, married. Now they looked at him not just as their spiritual guide, but as their last hope against the coming storm. "Violence is not the answer," he began, but was cut off by Tom Jackson, a young rancher. "With all due respect, Father, prayers won't stop bullets." Tom's face was flushed with frustration. "We've all heard the whispers. Some say you weren't always a priest. Some say you know how to fight." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Elijah's hands gripped the pulpit tighter, his knuckles turning white. Before he could respond, the church door opened, and Abigail stepped in, her presence commanding immediate attention. "I've known Father Elijah longer than any of you," she said, moving down the center aisle. "And I can tell you this, he's a man who's always done what's right, even when it wasn't easy." She turned to face him, her eyes challenging. "The question is, what's right now, Elijah? Is it right to let these people suffer because you're afraid of your past?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elijah looked out over the congregation, seeing not just fear in their eyes, but hope. Hope that their gentle priest might be something more, something their town desperately needed. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the hushed church. "The path you want me to walk, it's one that leads to darkness." "Sometimes," Abigail countered, "the Lord requires us to walk through darkness to reach the light. Your past isn't a curse, Elijah. Maybe it's a gift, one given to you for exactly this moment." More voices joined in, pleading for action. Martha Cooper, clutching her infant son, spoke through tears. "Blackjack's men won't show mercy. They'll take everything, destroy everyone. Please, Father, if you can help us, if you know how to fight." Elijah closed his eyes, memories washing over him. The weight of a gun in his hand, the speed of his draw, the lives he'd taken and those he'd saved. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. "The Lord teaches us to turn the other cheek," he said slowly, "but he also teaches us to protect the innocent." He stepped down from the pulpit, his movements suddenly more precise, more measured. "I will help you, but not as a gunfighter. We'll defend our town together as a community." "And if that's not enough," someone called out. Elijah's response was quiet but carried an edge of steel that made several people shift in their seats. "Then may God have mercy on their souls, because the saint won't." The name hung in the air like gun smoke, confirming what many had suspected. Their gentle priest had indeed been someone else once, someone legendary, someone feared. And now, that man was awakening. Dawn broke over Dustwood with a new energy. Behind the church, in a space normally used for Sunday socials, Father Elijah stood before a gathered crowd of townspeople. He'd removed his clerical collar, and though he still wore his black shirt, something about his bearing had shifted. There was a subtle authority in his stance that spoke of years of hard-earned experience. "The key to defending our homes isn't just about fighting," he began, his voice carrying across the yard. "It's about preparation, strategy, and most importantly, working together." He gestured to several wagons and barrels they'd gathered. "Our first task is to create defensive positions without appearing threatening." Sarah Miller raised her hand tentatively. "But Father, how can we possibly stand against their guns?" "By being smarter," he replied, moving to demonstrate. "Watch carefully. The simplest movements can save your life." He showed them how to move quickly between cover, how to make themselves smaller targets, and how to use the town's layout to their advantage. As the morning progressed, Elijah's instruction revealed glimpses of his past life. The way he handled himself, the precision of his movements, the tactical knowledge he possessed. It all spoke of someone who'd spent years surviving in a violent world. "Remember," he said, helping Mr. Peterson position himself behind a barrel, "our goal isn't to defeat them in open combat. It's to make taking our town more trouble than it's worth." Abigail watched from the sidelines, noting how the townspeople's fear began to transform into determination. Even the children were involved, learning to serve as lookouts and messengers. Young Tommy Cooper, no more than 12, proved particularly adept at moving silently between buildings. "You're teaching them to fight without fighting," she observed during a brief break, passing Elijah a canteen of water. He took a long drink before responding. "The best victories are won without firing a shot." But his hand unconsciously moved to his side, where a gun would have rested years ago. The training continued through the afternoon. Elijah taught them to coordinate their movements, to communicate with subtle signals, to support each other. The townspeople who'd lived together for years but often kept to themselves found new strength in their unity. "Think like water," he instructed, demonstrating how to flow from one position to another. Flexible, adaptive, but impossible to grasp or destroy completely. By sunset, the transformation was remarkable. The same people who'd cowered before Blackjack's gang now moved with purpose and confidence. They weren't gunslingers or soldiers, but they were no longer helpless victims either. As the training session ended, Tom Jackson approached Elijah. "This is all well and good, Father, but what happens when the shooting starts? When they come at us with real violence?" Elijah's response was measured, but there was an underlying hardness to his words. "Then they'll learn that faith doesn't make us weak. It gives us the strength to do what must be done." The townsfolk dispersed to their homes, muscles sore but spirits lifted. They'd taken the first steps toward defending their town, guided by a man who seemed to bridge two worlds, the peace of the church and the violence of the frontier. The morning calm shattered as Blackjack's gang thundered into Dustwood. Their numbers now swelled to 30 men. The sound of their approach sent the townspeople scrambling to their practiced positions, though Elijah had instructed them to appear unprepared. They'd spent days setting up their defenses while making them look like ordinary town business. Blackjack rode straight to the church where Elijah stood waiting. This time, the outlaw leader's usual swagger was tinged with something else, a hint of suspicion at the subtle changes in the town's layout, at the way the people moved with less fear. "Looks like you've been busy, preacher," Blackjack called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Moving wagons, stacking barrels, almost like you're preparing for something." His hand rested casually on his holstered gun, a gesture meant to intimidate. Elijah remained motionless on the church steps, his hands clasped before him. "We're merely organizing for the harvest festival," he replied calmly. "The Lord teaches us to maintain order in all things." Blackjack dismounted, his spurs jingling as he approached the church. The gang spread out behind him, their eyes scanning the buildings, noting the changes. The snake-tattooed man from before whispered something in Blackjack's ear, pointing to the newly positioned wagons. "You know what I think?" Blackjack's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "I think you're lying to me, preacher, and I don't like being lied to." He turned to face the gathered townspeople. "Maybe we should start with burning down this pretty little church of yours. Show everyone what happens when they try to get clever." Elijah stepped forward, placing himself between Blackjack and the church door. "Touch this house of God," he said quietly, "and you'll answer to a higher power than you're prepared to face." Something in his tone made Blackjack pause. He studied Elijah more carefully, noting the way the priest stood, balanced, ready, his stillness that of a coiled spring rather than fear. For the first time, doubt flickered across the outlaw's face. "You remind me of someone," Blackjack said slowly. "There were stories about a gunfighter they called the Saint. They said he could quote scripture while putting a bullet through your heart." He circled Elijah like a predator, searching for confirmation. "But that can't be you, can it? The Saint wouldn't hide behind a collar." Elijah's response was measured, his eyes never leaving Blackjack's. Every man has a past. The question is what he chooses to do with his future. Blackjack spat in the dust. "Well, here's your future, preacher. You have 1 week. 1 week to gather every bit of value in this miserable town. Gold, supplies, ammunition. When we return, you'll hand it all over or we'll burn everything to the ground, starting with your precious church." He mounted his horse, then added with a cruel smile, "And just to make sure you understand how serious we are." He nodded to his men, who produced torches. In a matter of seconds, they'd set fire to the livery stable at the edge of town. As the flames began to rise, Blackjack's laughter echoed through the street. "Consider that a down payment on what's coming. 1 week, preacher. Make it count." The gang rode out, leaving the townspeople rushing to fight the fire. But even as they worked to save the stable, there was a new resolve in their movements. They'd seen something in Father Elijah's confrontation with Blackjack, a glimpse of the man he used to be, and perhaps the man he needed to become again. After the sun had set and the town lay quiet, Father Elijah stood alone in the church basement, the lamplight casting long shadows across the stone walls. The wooden chest from beneath the altar lay open before him, revealing 2 pearl-handled revolvers nestled in worn leather holsters. They gleamed in the dim light, untouched for 5 years, but still maintained with reverent care. His hands moved with practiced precision as he checked the weapon's mechanisms, muscle memory taking over despite the years of disuse. The familiar weight of the guns brought a flood of memories, both of lives he'd taken and those he'd saved. "I swore I'd never wear these again," he whispered to the empty room, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "Lord, forgive me for what I must do." Outside, the town had been transformed. Under cover of darkness, the defensive preparations intensified. Wagons were reinforced with metal plating, barricades were strategically placed, and escape routes were planned for the women and children. Every position had been carefully chosen to funnel Blackjack's gang into areas where they'd be most vulnerable. In the pre-dawn hours, while the town slept, Elijah practiced. His movements were fluid, each draw precise, each aim perfect. He'd found an isolated spot behind the church where he could work without being seen, maintaining the skills he'd hoped never to use again. "I thought I might find you here," Abigail's voice startled him mid-draw. She stood in the shadows, watching as he holstered the gun with lightning speed. "You shouldn't be out this late," he said, but there was no real admonishment in his voice. "Neither should you," she replied, stepping into the lamplight. "But we both know why you are." She studied him for a moment, noting how naturally he wore the guns. "You know, protecting others isn't a sin, Elijah. Even Jesus drove the money changers from the temple." Elijah smiled sadly. "There's a difference between driving out money changers and what I used to do. The things I've done, Abigail. The lives I've taken." "We're in defense of the innocent," she finished firmly. "I remember the stories about the saint, how he gave criminals a chance to surrender, how he tried to wound rather than kill, how he protected those who couldn't protect themselves." Her words hung in the air as Elijah resumed his practice, his movements becoming more confident with each passing moment. "The speed is still there," he admitted quietly, "but I pray I won't need it." "We all pray for that," Abigail responded. But we also thank God that you're here, that you have these skills. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Elijah. Maybe this is why you were led to Dustwood." As if to punctuate her words, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. They could hear the town starting to wake, people moving to their assigned positions for another day of preparation. "Whatever happens," Elijah said, holstering his guns for the last time that morning, "I won't let them harm this town, even if it means becoming the saint one last time." The church was filled to capacity on the night before Blackjack's deadline. Candlelight flickered across worried faces as Father Elijah stood before his congregation, his presence somehow both gentle and formidable. The pearl-handled revolvers remained hidden beneath his priestly robes, a weight he'd grown reaccustomed to over the past few days. "Tomorrow," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "we face a test of not just our faith, but our unity. Our strength lies not in weapons or walls, but in our bond as a community." His eyes met those of each person in turn, the shopkeepers, the farmers, the families who'd made Dustwood their home. "I see fear in your eyes," he continued, stepping down from the pulpit to walk among the pews. "That's natural. But I also see courage. I see determination. I see people who've chosen to stand together rather than kneel apart." Sarah Miller clutched her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face. Young Tommy Cooper sat straight-backed beside his mother, trying to look brave. Mr. Peterson's bruises had faded, but the resolve in his eyes burned brighter than ever. "Some of you have asked about my past," Elijah said, his voice softening, "about who I was before I came to Dustwood. The truth is, I was a different man then. I walked a path of violence, though I tried to walk it justly. I became the saint not because I sought glory, but because I couldn't stand by while the innocent suffered." A murmur rippled through the congregation at this confirmation of the rumors. Abigail, sitting in the front pew, nodded encouragingly. "But here's what I've learned," Elijah continued, returning to the pulpit. "Sometimes the Lord doesn't ask us to forget our past. He asks us to use it in His service. Tomorrow, if violence finds us, we will meet it not with fear, but with the righteous strength of a community united in purpose." He raised his hands in blessing. "Let us pray not for victory through bloodshed, but for the wisdom to protect what we love without losing who we are. Let us pray for the strength to stand firm, the courage to act justly, and the mercy to show compassion even to our enemies." The congregation bowed their heads as Elijah led them in prayer. The words weren't just ritual, they were a binding together of souls, a strengthening of resolve. When they raised their heads, there was a new light in their eyes, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. As the service ended and people began to file out, many stopped to embrace each other, to offer words of encouragement. They moved with purpose, each heading to their assigned positions for the night watch. Abigail approached Elijah as the last parishioner left. "You've given them something more valuable than guns or tactics," she said softly. "You've given them faith in themselves." Elijah touched the cross at his neck, then the guns at his sides. "Faith is powerful," he replied, "but tomorrow we may need both the cross and the sword." The church fell silent as darkness settled over Dustwood. The night ahead would be long, filled with anticipation of what the dawn would bring. Dawn painted the sky in shades of crimson as the first riders appeared on the horizon. Blackjack's gang had swelled to over 40 men, their approach deliberate and menacing. The morning air carried the thunder of hooves and the jingle of spurs as they surrounded the town. Father Elijah stood in the church doorway, watching as Blackjack rode to the center of the town square. The outlaw leader's confidence was evident in his swagger as he dismounted, though his eyes narrowed at the sight of the town's preparations. "Well, well," Blackjack called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Looks like the preacher's been busy, but logs and wagons won't stop bullets, friend." He spread his arms wide, gesturing to his men. "We've got you outnumbered 2-1. Be smart about this. Give us what we want and maybe we'll leave your precious church standing." Behind their barricades, The townspeople held their positions just as they'd practiced. Young Tommy Cooper crouched behind a reinforced water trough, ready to relay signals. Sarah Miller and 3 other women had taken positions in the upper floor of the general store, armed with their husbands' hunting rifles. "This is your last chance to leave in peace," Elijah responded, his voice steady and clear. "There's nothing for you here except regret." Blackjack's face darkened. "Have it your way." He turned to his men, raising his arm. "Burn them out! Show these farmers what happens when they—" His words cut off as a warning shot rang out from one of the defensive positions, kicking up dust at his feet. The outlaws instinctively scattered, several reaching for their guns. "First blood's yours," Blackjack snarled. "Now you'll see what that gets you." He gave the signal and his men charged forward. The battle erupted in earnest. The townspeople, following Elijah's training, worked in coordinated groups. When the outlaws tried to rush one barricade, they found themselves caught in crossfire from another. Every attempt to gain ground was met with desperate but organized resistance. Mr. Peterson and his group managed to drive back 3 outlaws trying to flank the general store. Sarah Miller proved to be a surprisingly good shot, her rifle keeping the attackers from gaining any solid foothold on the north side of town. But the outlaws' superior numbers began to tell. 2 of Blackjack's men managed to set fire to a barricade, while others kept up a steady stream of covering fire. The townsfolk were forced to fall back to their secondary positions. "They're breaking through!" Tom Jackson shouted from his position near the saloon. "We can't hold them much longer!" Elijah watched from the church steps as the battle began to turn. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, had prayed for another way. But as he saw his people, his flock, being pushed back, he knew the time had come. With deliberate movements, he removed his clerical collar and drew the pearl-handled revolvers from beneath his robes. "Lord," he whispered, "forgive me for what I must do." The saint was about to return to battle. The transformation was instant and absolute. As Father Elijah stepped into the street, his movements fluid and precise. The very air seemed to change. Gone was the gentle priest, replaced by something altogether different. A figure of legend stepped straight from the pages of dime store novels. "Hold your fire!" Elijah's voice cut through the chaos, carrying an authority that made both sides pause. The pearl-handled revolvers gleamed in the morning sun as he walked forward, his black robes billowing in the dusty wind. Black Jack, who had been directing his men from behind an overturned wagon, emerged with a look of dawning recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed. "It really is you, the saint himself." "Last chance, Black Jack," Elijah called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Take your men and ride out. Don't make me do what I've sworn never to do again." The outlaw leader's response was a harsh laugh. "Boys, forget the town. Whoever brings me the saint's head gets double share." 5 men broke from their positions, charging forward with guns drawn. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Elijah's hands moved with impossible speed. 2 shots rang out, and 2 attackers dropped their weapons, clutching wounded hands. Another pair of shots disabled 2 more guns. The 5th man simply dropped his weapon and ran. "Still trying not to kill, Saint?" Blackjack mocked, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. "That mercy will get you killed one day." "It's not mercy," Elijah replied, continuing his steady advance. "It's justice, something you wouldn't understand." More outlaws opened fire, but Elijah moved like smoke between cover, his shots precise and deliberate. Each bullet found its mark: a gun hand, a shoulder, a leg, disabling rather than killing. The sight of their legendary opponent moving with such deadly grace began to unnerve Blackjack's men. "He ain't human!" one shouted, backing away. "No one can shoot like that!" From their positions, the townspeople watched in awe as their gentle priest systematically dismantled the outlaw force. Each movement was calculated, each shot purposeful. This wasn't random violence. It was surgical precision backed by years of experience. Black Jack, seeing his men's resolve crumbling, stepped into the street. "Just you and me then, Saint. Let's see if the legend lives up to reality." Elijah stopped 20 paces from his opponent. "It doesn't have to end this way." "Oh, but it does." Black Jack's hand dropped to his gun. The final draw happened faster than anyone could follow. 2 shots rang out as one. Black Jack's bullet whistled past Elijah's ear. Elijah's shot struck Black Jack's gun, sending it spinning from his grip. The outlaw leader stood frozen, staring at his empty hand in disbelief. "You could have killed me!" "That's not who I am anymore," Elijah replied, his gun still trained on his opponent. "But if you ever return to Dustwood, I might forget that fact." In the aftermath of the battle, Dustwood seemed to exhale collectively. The remaining outlaws fled, carrying their wounded, while Black Jack was taken into custody by Sheriff Anderson, who'd arrived with a posse drawn by the sound of gunfire. The town had survived, transformed not just by their victory, but by the bonds forged in defending it. The townspeople emerged from their positions, gathering in the square where just moments before bullets had flown. They moved with a new confidence, helping the wounded, extinguishing small fires, and beginning the work of rebuilding. Even the damage seemed less severe than it might have been, thanks to Elijah's precise strategy and supernatural shooting. "I've been chasing Black Jack's gang for months," Sheriff Anderson said, approaching Elijah, who had returned his guns to their holsters. "Never thought I'd find them brought down by a priest." He paused, studying Elijah's face. "Though you're not just a priest, are you? The saint. Never thought I'd meet the legend in person." Elijah stood quietly as the townspeople gathered around, their faces showing a mix of awe, gratitude, and newfound understanding. Young Tommy Cooper pushed through the crowd, his eyes wide with wonder. "Father Elijah," the boy said, "you were amazing. The way you moved, the way you shot, but you didn't kill anyone, not even Black Jack." Elijah knelt down to the boy's level. "Taking life is easy, Tommy. Showing mercy, even to our enemies. That's the true test of strength." Sarah Miller stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "You could have left," she said softly. "When Black Jack first came, you could have moved on to another town, but you stayed. You taught us to defend ourselves." "A shepherd doesn't abandon his flock," Elijah replied, touching the cross that still hung around his neck. "And you proved yourselves worthy of protection. Every one of you stood your ground, fought for your homes, supported each other." Abigail approached, carrying his clerical collar. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said, handing it to him. "He gave you those skills for a reason, Elijah. Today proved that being the saint and being a priest aren't as different as you thought. Both protect the innocent. Both fight for justice." The townspeople murmured in agreement. Mr. Peterson, his arm in a makeshift sling from the fight, spoke up. "Will you stay with us, Father? Now that everyone knows who you were, who you are?" Elijah looked around at the faces before him, faces of people he'd counseled, prayed with, and now fought beside. He saw no fear in their eyes, no judgment for his past. Instead, he saw acceptance, understanding, and trust. "Dustwood is my home," he said finally, replacing his collar. "The saint was who I was. Being your priest is who I am. Today showed me that perhaps both sides of my life serve God's purpose in their own way." A cheer went up from the crowd, and the work of rebuilding began in earnest. The town had changed, but not just physically. They had discovered their own strength, their ability to stand together against any threat. And they had learned that sometimes faith wore many faces, even that of a legendary gunslinger turned priest. 1 week after the battle, Dustwood's church bell rang out across the valley, calling the faithful to Sunday service. Father Elijah stood at the altar, the morning sun streaming through the stained glass windows. Behind him lay the wooden chest containing his pearl-handled revolvers. "Today," he began, "I want to talk about redemption. Not just the kind we find in Scripture, but the kind we forge through our actions and our willingness to face our past rather than hide from it." He stepped down from the pulpit, moving among his congregation. For years, I ran from who I was, believing the saint had no place in a house of God. But this past week has taught me that God uses every part of who we are in His plan. The townspeople nodded, many reaching out to touch his robes as he passed. In the front pew, Abigail smiled, tears in her eyes. "Look at what we accomplished together," Elijah continued, "not just in defending our town, but in showing mercy even to those who would harm us. We proved that strength and compassion can walk hand in hand." He returned to the altar, touching the cross at his neck. Redemption isn't about erasing who we were, but about using all that we are in service of something greater. Through the open church doors, they could see Dustwood spreading out before them, renewed and stronger than ever. Elijah watched his flock with deep peace in his heart, no longer the saint hiding behind a collar, but a shepherd capable of both blessing and protecting his flock. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to reconcile your past with your present? Subscribe for more inspiring tales of redemption.